Since Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, Canada has undergone significant changes. While Trudeau's progressive policies initially gained international praise, critics argue that his government has created challenges in 4 key areas: immigration, housing, economic stability, and crime. This piece delves into these criticisms with data-driven insights and real-life examples to explore how Trudeau's policies have impacted the daily lives of Canadians. 1. Migration, a policy with unintended consequences. Canada has historically been a pro-immigration country, relying on newcomers to grow its economy and fill labor shortages. But Trudeau's policies have dramatically accelerated the pace and volume of immigration, raising concerns about the country's capacity to absorb new residents effectively. Rapid growth in immigration rates. In 2022, Canada welcomed 437,000 immigrants, a record-breaking figure and one of the highest per capita in the world. This figure follows a trend under Trudeau, with Canada's annual immigration rate increasing by over 35% from previous decades. By 2025, the government's targets indicate that Canada could welcome over 1.5 million new immigrants. Example: Toronto, one of Canada's major immigration hubs, has seen its population grow by nearly 10% since 2016. According to recent city planning reports, Toronto has struggled to accommodate this rapid growth, resulting in crowded schools, overwhelmed hospitals, and strained public services. Strain on public services. The rapid increase in population has overwhelmed Canadian public services. In Ontario, for example, emergency rooms have reported unprecedented wait times. A 2023 report by the Ontario Health Coalition revealed that ER wait times increased by 20% between 2015 and 2023, directly impacting the quality of healthcare available. Real-life impact. For families in places like Brampton, a Toronto suburb with a high number of immigrants, finding a family doctor has become increasingly difficult. Residents report waiting weeks for basic appointments, with some even traveling to other cities for care. Critics argue that the surge in immigration has placed too much pressure on a healthcare system already struggling with staff shortages. Housing crisis exacerbated by migration. Housing supply has not kept pace with population growth. Many cities, including Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, have seen sharp rises in home prices and rents. In the Greater Toronto Area, a surge in demand due to immigration has led to bidding wars, making it difficult for locals to secure affordable housing. Statistics. The Canadian Real Estate Association reported that the average home price in Canada increased from $450,000 in 2015 to nearly $800,000 in 2023. In Toronto, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is over $2,300 per month. 2. Housing, the unaffordable reality for many Canadians. Trudeau's government has introduced several policies intended to make housing more affordable, such as the first-time homebuyer incentive and a ban on foreign homebuyers. However, critics argue these measures are insufficient or misguided, failing to address the core issues that drive up prices. Skyrocketing home prices and inadequate supply. Between 2015 and 2023, home prices rose by over 75% nationally, making Canada one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. The first-time homebuyer incentive, a program offering shared equity mortgages with the government, aimed to help middle-income Canadians afford homes. However, critics claim it merely raised demand without increasing supply, pushing prices higher. Example: in Vancouver, a city facing one of Canada's most severe housing shortages, locals report difficulty buying homes even after saving for years. A 2022 survey by the Vancouver Real Estate Board showed that 85% of residents believe housing is unaffordable, with many blaming inadequate government action on supply issues. Rising rent prices. As the home buying market became less accessible, demand for rental properties surged. The result? Rental prices shot up, especially in metropolitan areas. Canada's national rental rate increased by 15% in 2023 alone, with cities like Toronto and Vancouver seeing even steeper rises. Real-life impact. For instance, 34-year-old Jonathan Lee, a teacher in Toronto, recently had to move further from his workplace because rent prices downtown were unaffordable. He explains that rising costs have affected his quality of life, saying, "I'm spending more time commuting and less time with my family, and even then, the rent is still a stretch. Policy criticism. Critics argue that Trudeau's foreign buyers tax, a 2-year ban implemented in 2022, was too little, too late. Speculation from foreign investors contributed to price increases for years before this policy was enacted, and some claim it lacks enforcement. Meanwhile, Trudeau's housing plan to build 3.5 million homes by 2030 faces skepticism due to logistical and funding challenges. 3. Economic decline. Struggling economy, struggling Canadians. Trudeau inherited a strong economy, but since 2015, Canada has faced a series of economic challenges. Rising inflation, high living costs, and slowing job growth have left Canadians feeling the strain, high inflation and rising living costs. Canada's inflation rate peaked at 6.3% in 2022, with food inflation reaching an alarming 10%. While this aligns with global trends, critics argue that Trudeau's policies have amplified inflationary pressures. His government's carbon tax, for example, has contributed to increased fuel costs, making transport and food more expensive for Canadians. Example: the average Canadian household now spends an additional $300 monthly on groceries compared to 5 years ago. According to Statistics Canada, low-income families have been hit hardest, with many turning to food banks. In Toronto, food bank usage increased by 26% between 2020 and 2022. Impact of the carbon tax on the economy. The carbon tax, which began at $20 per ton of emissions in 2019 and increased to $65 per ton by 2023, was intended to incentivize green practices. However, it has raised costs for industries reliant on transportation and energy, ultimately making consumer goods more expensive. Real-life impact. In Alberta, where the oil and gas industry forms a large part of the economy, businesses have expressed frustration with the carbon tax. Small trucking companies, like Calgary-based Arjun Freight, report higher operational costs, which are passed on to consumers. Owner Surinder Singh stated, "Our costs keep going up, and customers are feeling it. Many small operators are barely surviving." Slowing job growth and financial insecurity. The promise of job creation in sectors like green energy has been slow to materialize, leaving many Canadians unemployed or underemployed. Meanwhile, Statistics Canada reports that 47% of Canadian families live paycheck to paycheck, a concerning rise from previous years. Policy criticism. Some argue that Trudeau's economic policies prioritize climate goals over immediate economic needs, leaving working Canadians vulnerable. According to a survey by Abacus Data, 67% of Canadians expressed frustration that the government has not done enough to address the high cost of living. 4. Crime rates. A surge in violence and lawlessness. Canada's crime rate has increased significantly, particularly in urban centres. Critics argue that Trudeau's government has failed to address the root causes of crime and has implemented policies that prioritize rehabilitation over deterrence. Rising crime statistics. According to Statistics Canada, the country's overall crime rate increased by 12% from 2015 to 2023, with violent crime rates seeing an even sharper increase of nearly 40%. Major cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary report higher rates of gang-related violence and gun crime. Example: in 2023, Toronto recorded 90 homicides, the highest in over a decade. The city's police chief attributed this spike to a combination of gang activity, drug trafficking, and reduced police presence due to budget constraints. Policy criticism, rehabilitation versus deterrence. Trudeau's government has introduced legislation aimed at reducing incarceration rates and focusing on rehabilitation, particularly for non-violent offenders. However, critics argue that this approach has emboldened criminals rather than discouraging crime. Real-life impact. In British Columbia, crime in areas like Surrey has surged. Local business owners report thefts and break-ins, with some blaming reduced policing and lenient sentencing. Rick Dillon, who owns a small store in Surrey, explains, "I've had my store broken into twice this year. The thieves know they'll just get a slap on the wrist. It's demoralizing for small business owners like me." Gang and drug-related crime. Gang violence has become a growing concern, particularly in areas like the Greater Toronto Area. The Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction reported that fentanyl-related overdoses have doubled since 2015, partly due to drug trafficking and organized crime. Conclusion: has Trudeau's leadership hurt Canada? The data suggests that Trudeau's policies have had mixed results, with many Canadians feeling the impact on their quality of life. Unchecked immigration has strained public services. Surging housing costs have left people priced out of their communities. Economic policies have struggled to address rising living costs. And an increase in crime has caused a sense of insecurity. While some argue that Trudeau's policies align with Canada's progressive values, critics claim they have failed to meet the practical needs of Canadians. The high cost of living, an inaccessible housing market, economic strain, and rising crime rates paint a picture of a Canada under strain. As Canadians look toward the future, questions remain about whether Trudeau's policies can be adapted to provide relief. Whether he will remain in power or another party will take the reins, addressing these pressing issues will be crucial in restoring stability and prosperity in Canada.